Hi, this is Tasty Bento here. I'm going to be going through a Bukkit plugin called Catapult. It's one that I just wrote, and this is going to be a code walkthrough. So I'm going to be explaining what the various lines of code do in this plugin. I will not be writing the code, as you can see it's already written, but I'm going to be stepping through it so that you can understand what it does. I'm going to assume that you already have experience with writing at least some plugins, and you also have your Eclipse or IntelliJ set up so that you're able to do compilation. If not, please look at another tutorial on that because I won't be covering that in this one. So the aim of this plugin is that it's going to catapult a player when they walk over a gold pressure plate. And you've probably seen this on some spawn area. The players will run, and when you hit a plate, it will catapult you further so that you don't have to run all the way. So that was what I was aiming for here. So let's look at the code. First of all, it's going to be a class named Catapult, and it's extending the Bukkit Java plugin. And because this is a single class plugin, it will also be implementing the listener that enables it to listen for events that happen in the server. Skipping ahead, we have the two essential methods on enable and on disable. On enable will be run when the plugin starts, and on disable when the plugin is disabled. In this particular plugin, there's going to be nothing to do for disabling. But on enabling, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. The first thing is that I'm going to be saving the default configuration. And what this does, as it says in the pop-up here, is that it saves the raw contents of the defile file config.yml. And if you look at my files here for Catapult, I have config.yml. And config.yml, which I'll just bring up, has only two settings. One is the vertical speed that will be applied when a player goes over a plate. And the second one is the horizontal speed or multiplier to whatever they're already doing. So if they're running forwards, this will accelerate them by 2 times. And the benefit of putting it into a config file is that admins or you yourself as the developer can change these on the fly without having to recompile. So let's just put that away and go back to Catapult. So what that does there is it saves the default configuration if it doesn't exist already. And then we're going to get some values out of it. And I'm looking at two values that are defined up here. The first one is the vertical speed, and the second one is the horizontal multiplier, and they are doubles. And using this get config, you're able to essentially grab the values from the config file, and you can ask for exactly what type of value you want. And so there's a variety of options here. So there's get double, there's get int, get long, there's just a get boolean. There's lots of different options here, even including very specific items, item stacks, lists, vectors, everything could be stored here. Typically what I do is, in addition to getting the value, and in this case you can see it's vspeed, that is the text that is described. The second parameter here is also the default value. So if the file was missing, or if the file, sorry, it should say if this value is missing from the file, then this will be the default that is used. And usually you want to pick something here that you know works. So in this case, 0.1 will be added to your vertical speed, and your horizontal speed will be multiplied by 2, and we'll see how that works later. The final thing that needs to be done in the enable here is that we're going to register for some events. And in order to do that, you get the server, you get the plugin manager, and then you register the events. And it takes two parameters. The first one is what actually is the listener, and in this case, it is the same class, so it's just this. And then what is the plugin that is related to that is being registered, and again the plugin is itself this. If you had a separate class for your events, then you would create it and put it in here. Okay, so now we've stepped through the on enable. I'm now going to move on to the events, and we've got two events here. One is the player move event, and the second one is on plate step. Obviously, the on-plate step is when someone hits a plate, and in order to actually detect that, and I'll go over this for one first, you need to actually use the player interact event. The reason for that is because stepping on a plate is like interacting with something in the game. You're stepping on it and it's clicking. And so, as you can see, it's this event is called when a player interacts with an object or air. And with any event, before you write this code, you also need to indicate it with this tag here, event handler. And then there's a couple of options that you've got. And let me just explain these. First one is priority. Second one is ignore cancelled. So priority, you're able to define when in the hierarchy of events will this particular method be fired. And so what happens is the server, anytime a player interacts with something, will tell every registered event that it's happening. And you can decide when you want to listen in and what your priority is. And as I want this to be fired pretty early on compared to any other events or any other plugins, I've picked a low priority. Lowest means that it will try to be the very first event that's fired. Highest will mean that it's pretty much the last time. Monitor is even higher than highest and is technically not meant to actually do anything except just find out what event was there for. As it says, no modifications to the event should be made under this priority. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because you would think, oh, I want my event to be very, fired first, so therefore it must be the highest priority. But that doesn't seem to be the way that it works. The second parameter is ignore cancelled, and as it says here, it defines if the handler, which is this method here, will be ignored if the event has already been cancelled. So if a previous plugin or a previous method has decided to cancel this particular event for some reason, if this is true, then this will not be run at all. The only time you want to set this to false is if for some reason you're writing a method that really has to override anything else. Okay, so now moving on. I've got some debug statements here that I've commented out for now, but I generally find that it's very useful to put in debug statements into the console. And you can use the getlogger info. You could perhaps put some text in like debug to make it clear that it's debug so that if you forget to remove them, it will be obvious later on. You can use more fancy ways to debug this, such as creating a class that you send text to, and then you have a toggle to switch it on and off. I've just found that commenting stuff out works just as well. So in this case, what I had was I had an indication that the event was being called, and you can use this get event name here that is, like it says, a convenience method for providing a user-friendly identifier. Basically what happens is that when pressure plate, it would say pressure plate equals player interact event every time that pops up. Similarly, there is a action that comes from it that will return exactly what the player's doing, and you'll see that I don't really care about that, but sometimes it's of interest. And then the one which I do care about is what was clicked. And in this case, stepped on or clicked is synonymous. So you were able to find out what block was clicked and what type of the block. So in this next line, what I'm doing is very simple. I'm checking to see if the type of the click block is equal to a gold plate. Very simple. What this means though is that any world that the server is running, any gold plate will trigger this code here. So in a more sophisticated plugin, you may want to add in things like a world check to see if this is operating in a particular world or not. The next thing that I need to do is I'm going to be changing the player's velocity. And there is a couple of problems with this in that the velocity that this function provides is only the very immediate velocity that the player has and is actually often zero. This is just a problem with the architecture of the game, and it's that the server really doesn't keep a track on what the velocity of the player is, except in a very, very small slice of time. And it's really the client that handles a lot of the velocity side of things. So this function is actually virtually useless, and that is why we actually have to keep a track of players' velocities. What I'm going to do is I'm going to step to this next function here, this next handler, which does just that. So what it does is it keeps a moving average of the player's velocity. Before I go on to exactly how that works, I should talk a little bit about hash maps. And hash maps are very useful and commonly used in Bukkit plugins to keep a track, especially on what players are doing and what state a particular player is in for whatever reason. If you're not familiar with a hash map, essentially it's like a mini database where you have a key that is looking up something and a value. In this case, the key that I'm using is the UUID, the unique user ID, and then the value that I'm looking for is a vector. A vector is a three-dimensional value, x, y, z, that I'm going to be using to keep a track on the velocity of the player. I do not recommend that you store player in here. We can just store the unique ID of the player. Generally, I use UUIDs to store anything as a reference. Okay, so moving on. This event is fired every time a player moves, and it's actually fired any time a player moves in any way, not just up and down, left and right, or forwards and backwards, but even if they're moving their head. And so it can get fired a lot. So anytime that you are writing a handler for player move event, you want to make it as absolutely as small as possible or as efficient as possible, because it's going to get called a lot. So I haven't added it, but you could put in some checks. For example, is this in the right world? If it's not, get out of there. Is it a movement that involves XYZ? If it's not, if it's just a head movement, then return immediately. Things like this. So you could add efficiencies here. But what does it do in this particular code? So first of all, I create a new velocity vector. This may be the first time that I've ever seen this player. And so then I check to see, is the player known inside my current hash map? So does it contain the key of the unique ID of the player? If it does, then I want to get whatever that pass velocity is. Otherwise, it's going to be 0. Then the velocity I'm going to store is actually the midpoint between where the player is going to, which is a value that you get from this event. Whenever the player moves, you're able to get where they're going from and when they're going to. So what I'm taking is the midpoint between the old velocity and where they're going to as a vector, subtracted from where they're going from as a vector. So this should give me the value here. Okay, so once I've got the average velocity, which is using this handy value here that just basically picks the midpoint. So what that means is that every time the player moves, we're going to get a velocity that's halfway between the old velocity and the new velocity. So that's kind of like a moving average. Then it's important that we store this back in the hash map. So this whole purpose of this function is just to continuously update the player's moving average velocity. So going back to on our step here, at this point we are now working out that the player has stepped on a gold plate. Just to initialize the velocity vector, we've grabbed their velocity. It may be nothing, it may be something. If we know about this player and we have their velocity in our hash map, then we'll get it. Once we've got this velocity, then we can add in the vertical speed. And we just use vector math there. So we create a new vector, and vectors are defined in 3 dimensions, so x, y, and z. So in this case, we're just adding some vertical speed to the y element. Then we are multiplying the overall vector of the velocity by a new vector. We're multiplying, and we're only going to be multiplying the x component, the z components, and the y component is multiplied by 1, which basically means it doesn't change. So after that, we then set the velocity for the player. This actually does work. So when you set velocity of a player, it basically bumps them in that particular direction with this particular velocity here. And then we also store it, because that's now their new velocity. We store that back into the hash map, and we set the overall event as cancelled. This is very important. By cancelling the event, what happens is that when the player interacts with the gold plate, all that happens is this code here. So that's the walkthrough of this. We're going to see some examples of what happens in gameplay.